So Ed, thank you for your time. Great to get you on board with this. Our Young Carers campaign has highlighted the issues that young carers have faced during lockdown. First and foremost, though, just tell us a little bit about your own story, because you indeed yourself were a young carer, weren't you?
I was indeed. My mum became terminally ill when I was 12. And because my dad had died when I was 4, my brother and I did a lot of the caring for her. She was terminally ill with a very painful form of cancer called bone cancer. And we nursed her at home for 3 years until she died when I was 15. Like a lot of carers' experiences, you have a very loving relationship, but it was very challenging, and it was often upsetting and tiring, exhausting, and people around you, friends at school, didn't really quite understand what was going on in your life. But I'm conscious, by the way, that young carers have a wide variety of different experiences. In many ways, there's no such thing as a young carer, because some young carers are looking after siblings who've got maybe physical disabilities. Some young carers are looking after their parents who either were dying, as in my case, or may have a mental health problem, may be physically disabled, may have a drug or alcohol problem. So the experience of young carers is very, very varied. And we should never generalize about young carers. We need to think about them as individuals, about the individual experience they are going through, and make sure, whether it's the school, whether it's social services, whoever it may be, they understand that individual young person and try to listen properly to them.
Obviously, those young carers have had that experience and a whole range of experiences in a whole range of different backgrounds, as you've suggested. And given the really difficult situation that you went through, when you add coronavirus, the pandemic, the lockdown on top of those responsibilities, that's something that no young person should have to face alone, is it?
Yeah, I can totally agree. I mean, I really worry about carers out there, and particularly young carers. I used to get some breaks by going to school. During the lockdown, I couldn't get to school. I used to get break by going and playing sport, when able to play sport. And so that relief, that respite, that break won't have been there for many young carers. And while they will, I'm sure in the vast majority of cases, really care about their relative, they need to have some escape just to get their mind in the right place. And if they don't, my really worry is their mental health could be impacted. Obviously, their educational chances could be impacted. And so I'm genuinely worried that what's happening out there, and we don't really have a feel for it. I mean, there are some surveys that are being undertaken, and they're not coming back with great results. I think people are being stressed, they're being anxious, and this is something that we need to give far more attention to, because, yeah, all young people are having problems during this pandemic, but I think young carers are amongst the group that need the most support.
Let's talk, if we can, about the political response for young carers. A lot of people, when they heard about the COVID bill going through Parliament, was thinking, well, OK, that's a response, and a pragmatic response to a global pandemic affecting people here in this country. When they later find out that COVID bill reduced the obligation of local councils to provide certain care packages to young carers, leaving some having to fend for themselves because of fears of the virus, because of lack of PPE, that was an unforeseen consequence that should have been foreseen by somebody, shouldn't it? That COVID bill shouldn't have impacted so negatively on those young carers.
Well, it wasn't totally unforeseen. In the second reading debate on that bill back in March, I raised the issue of people who needed support, not primarily young carers, but carers in general, disabled people in general. There's a whole category of people, including young carers, who local authorities would normally have some duty of support for. And in the Coronavirus Act, those responsibilities, those duties on local authorities were reduced. And I thought at the time that was wrong. We tabled amendments to stop it. The government weren't interested. And when the bill came for renewal, I made it clear ahead of time to the Prime Minister that if those parts of the Coronavirus Act didn't come out, we would have to vote against it. And we did vote against the renewal in the end, not because we didn't think there were some parts of the bill that were needed, but we just wanted to make a stand on behalf of carers, young carers, disabled people, because we just think it's wrong that their rights should be taken away. Because at this stage, in many ways, they need more support, not less. So it just didn't make sense.
What damage could have been done during that time? A young carer without support from a local authority, having to make potentially, in some cases, their own decision about whether or not they want support to come into their house or not, while they're reading stories on social media, in the news about this deadly virus, which is knocking at their front door. You can completely understand if they were to say, yeah, of course, don't come in. I'll have to take on that burden themselves. But that will come with consequences, won't it?
Yeah, without doubt. And I'm afraid we will discover those in the months and years ahead. I mean, I think for all of us, really, you know, the coronavirus was a really anxious moment. Is an anxious moment. I've got a disabled son who's got a neurological problem. He can't walk or talk, and you know, while I think he's quite robust in his health, fortunately, we're worried about how vulnerable he might be. And if you're looking after a parent who's ill, a parent who's disabled, a parent who's got some condition, or a sibling, a brother or sister's got some condition, you're going to be worried that they're going to be more vulnerable. And so that means that you're probably less likely to go out because you don't want to bring the virus back. And so you need that extra help. And so I don't know what's going on behind these closed doors. And we should be alarmed about this. And you know, sometimes people suffer in silence and sort of grin and bear it, but it won't be good for people's health long term.
Yeah, but both physical and of course mental health as well. Can we talk about a lack of data? How is it in 2020 that we don't know how many young carers there are in the country? In the UK at the moment, young people caring for siblings, parents with severe disabilities in some cases, mental health issues, drug and alcohol abuse, and there's not a register. The local authorities don't have an official list of how many there are. If we ask the question, how many are there, all we get is best guesses. Mm-hmm. That can't be right, can it?
It isn't right. It needs to be changed. We need to work with schools and local authorities to get that data and get it properly recorded. Let me be clear, though, we're going to need some training for people on this, because some young carers don't realise they're a young carer. And if they don't actually immediately offer that up, that they are caring for somebody, and don't see it in that role, it may be that we're underestimating it. I've seen some estimates that suggest that in most classes of 30 young people, there'll be 2 or 3 young carers. Now, there may be 1 or 2 of those who've got, you know, regularly daily caring responsibilities. When they leave home in the morning and go back in the evening, they're caring immediately. They're caring at weekends, they're caring at school holidays. There'll be others who the caring responsibility is shared with another parent, another sibling, and so it's not all falling on their shoulders the whole time. So there'll be different experiences. And so identifying the carers in the first place, those young people who are caring in these different ways, is critical. And because until you're measuring it, you know, we can't get a real handle on the level of support we need, the type of support we need, the way we need to ensure that educational and employment opportunities aren't lost, and so on and so forth. And there's a truism in politics: if you don't measure it, people don't know it's there, right? And so we've got to measure it, because then at least we can force governments and local governments to do more on it.
Is that a reason that governments haven't tried to measure it in the past? That they're worried what they might find? They're worried they might find something they suddenly need to invest in, find funding for? Is it easier just not to know and just presume that these carers will crack on as they always have done?
It may be. I don't always subscribe poor intentions to me. So maybe it just they haven't got around to it. But I think it's a mistake not to get around to it. And I would actually sort of question the assumption behind some people's view about this, that it's going to be an expense. Sometimes you have to pay money up front, but that actually helps in the long term, because the person is healthier, is able to work more. If you don't help people through the difficult times, and they themselves are therefore not able to contribute as much as they otherwise would have done, that means you're just not investing in the future. So helping young carers is an investment in the future. It's the right thing to do. It's also the sensible thing to do. And this is sometimes in the care debate we don't see, and it really demonstrates itself in young carers. If we can support them by identifying them, by listening to them, and then supporting them appropriately, then that's going to improve their life chances. And that's good for them, and it's good for the rest of us.
Our call to arms for the Young Carers campaign is to try and get the status of a young carer included in a school census. So as you pointed out, a school would need to identify a child, inform parents as to what young carers are, so that information could be passed through primary schools, secondary schools, would explain to a lot of teachers why a child maybe hadn't done their homework, would explain why a child was not able to go to a detention because they had caring responsibilities at home. Do you back that campaign, and do you back those calls for the school census to include that information of a child's young carer status?
Totally back it. It's a really good idea, and I think we should potentially even go further. I would want the Office for National Statistics to be brought in to make sure we've got the best form of statistics on young carers. It's essential that we have this for policy. It's also for the school. So you gave some very good examples about why a young person couldn't do a detention. But also, what happens if they're not able to do their homework because they've had caring responsibilities? What happens if they're late because they had to stay at home to look after the mother or the father for some reason? Often these young carers will get into trouble, and they may feel sort of either embarrassed or awkward about explaining why, because they don't want to talk about what's going on at home for completely understandable reasons. And then the teachers think they're a naughty kid. I mean, how wrong? That's just so wrong, isn't it? The pressure on these young people is so intense, can be so intense. And the last thing they want is extra stress and anxiety at school, and particularly when it's unfair. So that's why we've got to identify these young people, and then we've got to really listen to them. And I keep going back to this listening point, because I just think every young person is different anyway, and every young carer is different anyway. And unless the teachers in the school really understand what's going on in that person's life, they can't really help them. By the way, they can't educate them as well. And this can be a barrier to education. So it's really important that the school does understand what's going on in that person's life. I mean, I went to a great school, but they didn't know I was a young carer. So they didn't put anything in place.
But actually, that idea that if a primary school is handing over information to a secondary school and says, you're going to have 45, 50 kids in this cohort who are young carers, that school will then feel that they have to bring in an expert, somebody who can train staff into how to maybe potentially speak to those young people about their caring needs. They'd have to have those conversations, and they'd also be able to identify those children. So if they did spot things which otherwise they would normally class as the naughty kids, activities, they would know the truth, and that would be positive, because then that has less of a stigma. I'll give you the example. One young carer said to me she believes there's a stigma around young caring due to lack of information and ignorance, and she said that often it's only when things get really bad that there's a local authority intervention. Whereas if there was a more soft approach from earlier on, then that child wouldn't feel that stigma, would also be able to speak out more and say, I've been flagged as a young carer. Well, here's what I need some help on at the moment. And again, that reduced stigma allows that conversation to take place, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is about reducing stigma. I think actually it's also about upskilling people in the schools, because we can't necessarily expect every single teacher to know what to do. Maybe it needs to be part of their basic teacher training course. Maybe it should be part of the ongoing development of them as professionals in the inset days that they have in different schools. I think it's so important because we're not talking about a group of children that's a tiny, tiny minority. This is quite a lot. Every teacher will almost certainly have a young carer in one of their classes, possibly several. And I came at this from two angles. I came at it both from the young carers side and also for young people who are bereaved, because I'd lost both my parents when my mum died. And again, the school didn't really know how to handle it. I remember being said, by the head teacher, we've never had orphans before, which wasn't the easiest way to sort of broach the subject with me, I think understanding that in any class there'll be one person who's lost one or more parents, 2 or 3 carers, and giving teachers some skills to know how to deal with it, even if it's about both recognizing and then having an empathy with them so that they can point them to the school counselor, the school nurse, somebody who can actually be there and be a support for that young person and listen to them.
You mentioned how the Office for National Statistics could get involved. Can you just explain that a little bit more for us, please?
Yeah, I was actually doing some work for bereaved families, and it came this data problem, the fact that we don't collect the statistics, we don't know how many people are young carers. The same applied to how many young people in schools have suffered a bereavement of one or more parents. And it's because when you go and register a death, that information doesn't have to be collected. And I got frustrated when I was starting asking parliamentary questions and campaigning on this. So I wrote to the Office of National Statistics, and they came in and they found some data sets where they could make a very good estimate, but they would still like the raw data to be collected on a systemic basis. But they estimated that in a school, by the age of 16, there will be one in every class, one young person in every class who's lost one or more parents. So they tend to lose, more people lose their fathers and their mothers, and probably for obvious reasons. So this is a big issue, and why it's important is, let's come back to that child and that young person's life chances. If they've lost a parent, if they're a young carer, it's going to impact on them. And we need, as a society, as we try to give our young people their best chance in life, we need to understand what extra help these young people are going to need. What extra understanding, what extra, a little bit of extra time, a little bit of extra space, some other intervention that suits that individual person. And if we don't get the data, no one's going to say it's important. And my sense, just from the ONS work they did on bereaved children, this is a massive issue. And no one studied it properly because they never had the data. They never sort of looked at the different data sets and thought, oh, shock horror, if you lose a parent when you're a youngster, you don't perform so well academically. And one of the children's charities a few years ago looked at educational attainment of young carers, and their analysis showed that a young person who's been a young carer, it can impact on their grades at GCSE by 9 points. So if we want to improve education for everybody, we do need to understand what pressures young people are under. And obviously they come from other forms, not just bereavement or being a young carer. But when you know that there are these big categories of young people, maybe, just maybe, we get it right and give them the extra support, which will really improve those people's lives.
So, Sir Ed, during your conference speech, you said you wanted to be the voice of carers, the voice of carers in Parliament. We've spoken about the issue facing young carers and a potential part solution to some of those issues with the school census idea. Is that something now that you can take forward through Parliament? Is that something you can action?
Absolutely. I will campaign. I'd like to do it cross-party so that we can all achieve this, because it's not difficult, it's not expensive, and it will get that data to enable us to act. But I don't think we need to wait just till we get the data. There's lots of things that we should do. So as a Liberal Democrat, we have argued, for example, that a young person could be considered to be eligible for the carers allowance, which is a payment made to people who are caring for someone more than 35 hours a week. We've argued that there's a very strong case for young carers to have a bus pass. We've argued that they should get extra support in their education and then as they leave school in employment opportunities. In other words, tailoring packages to young people who've had these extra pressures on them that may have made life that much more difficult for them. And so, yes, we should get the data, but I don't think my key point to you is let's not wait. There's lots of things that we could do to help young people now. And there is some good practice out there, by the way. There are people and schools and local authorities who do some good stuff for young carers. Let's ensure that young carers, wherever they live, whichever school they go to, get that extra help.